Yes. Yeah. You're just very busy. Yes. Thank you very much for doing this. Looking forward to just talking to the sound man who asked me, are you going to be interested in the sofa for the lecture? And I said, you're probably the sofa.
Yes.
Just the two of you sit up there. And the advice is if you sort of sit on the inside of the chair, slightly closer to each other rather than massive distance away. So it's they're going in by slightly. So
Just sit me up to get
not just so much not to worry about I'll do my best. So it's if you, it's just the website is SLR, and then you need it says what point you want to do, and it's, if you're on your phone as well, that's it. You just, and then at the top of your briefing, all on this big screen behind you is the number to.
Yes. Oh, that's Gavin.
Okay.
There, hi. Good evening. Do come and take your seats. We've got the government chief scientist here. We mustn't keep her waiting. What will she think of the foundation of science and technology? Fantastic. Do come on through. Here we are. Brilliant. Brilliant. Oh, there's lots of people coming. Good. Do come on through and take your seats. Great. Welcome to this meeting of the Foundation of Science and Technology. As you can see, we've gone for a slightly different format than usual. We've gone for the comfy chairs option, which I think we last did when... Fireside chat. That's the genre, the fireside chat, which I think last very suitably, I think, was when I had a similar discussion with Patrick Vallance. And it's great that we're joined by Professor Dame Angela McLean for a discussion that'll begin between the two of us, and then we'll broaden out for both the people here physically and also on Slido, that we've had some technical issues getting through on Slido, and I hope that'll all be properly functioning in due course. I should thank our sponsors for this evening. We're very grateful to ARC, Advanced Research Clusters, and Rt for their support for this event. I'm sure you all know Dame Angela, the Chief Science Advisor. Of course, a very distinguished career, including at serving as a Fellow of All Souls College, Oxford. She's particularly interested in mathematical modeling of biology. She was, of course, the Chief Science Advisor in the MOD, and then in 2023 moved on to become the government's overall Chief Science Advisor, succeeding Sir Patrick Vallance. And we do appreciate your coming along and joining us this evening. So perhaps we might just start, Angela, by telling us, you've now been doing this job for over a year. What's your assessment of the role of Government Chief Scientist, and how does it compare with what you were expecting?
Well, it's definitely the best job in the world, without any question, because it's a wonderful mixture of quick fire. You're going to do 3 short meetings this morning, and then you'll have an afternoon spent on something a bit longer. So that is a great job for somebody with a short attention span. If I want to know more about something, particularly with good reason, I say to my lovely team in Go Science, I wonder if we should have a round table about that. And then we do. And then a set of people from academia and industry and the relevant parts who really, really know about it come in and answer our questions. And it's like sort of having a reverse tutorial with a bunch of profound experts in, it's actually not what I want to know about, it's what I think we really need to sort of get some very expert advice down on paper, because I think colleagues of mine across government need to know about. But since I'm very interested in the science that my colleagues in government want to know, that's always of great interest to me. They are a bit exhausting, the roundtables. In the summer, I must add, in the summer, I would literally go and lie underneath a tree in St James's Park after they were over, because, I mean, you know, it's just a lot of material thrown at you, and just to let it sort of sink in. So it's a terrific job. It is more varied than I had understood.
And of course, you came to it from having been the Chief Science Advisor in the MOD. And you could argue that one of the big changes in R&D policy in the UK in the last 10 or 15 years has been the rise of the security angle permeating so many decisions on science and technology, and a gradual recognition that just about everything is potentially dual use. Just compare it to your defence background before and the extent to which you found yourself drawing on that with your new enhanced role.
It is very useful to have had that time in defence. I mean, actually, I would say first to have had that run in the civil service. Because actually, although, I mean, I thought I understood the civil service. I'd done lots and lots of advisory work as an external on science advisory councils and things like that. I hadn't, well, no, I'd spent days shadowing people in the civil service, but I hadn't ever worked in the civil service. And I'll be honest with you, I mean, the culture shock was just tremendous. On moving to a full-time, 4 days a week job in the Ministry of Defence from being a full-time academic, it was like moving to a foreign country and having to speak this other language. And, you know, I mean, I used to be completely white. You know how it is when you, when you speak a foreign language all day and it's new, you go home and at 8 o'clock you're asleep because you're just so exhausted. And then, gosh, there are lots. Yes, it's very useful to have some familiarity with that one bit.
And when you say a different language, what do you think is the difference between the civil service public policy language and the scientific, rigorous language of empiricism and mathematical models?
I think I was in a meeting with other senior civil servants, and somebody started talking about this wonderful book she'd found called, it was called Radical Candor. I actually misheard her and thought it was called Radical Panda, and that's sort of quite a thing for civil servants to be candid. I think civil servants are very, very honest and truthful. But let's face it, I mean, the entirety of the joke of Yes Minister is about the gap between candour and honesty. And academics are very candid. I mean, sometimes to the point that it can be a bit painful, can't it? I mean, when somebody's very candid about why they think your idea is stupid. But I think we academics are used to that. And actually, I did already know that, because I'd been in circumstances where academics were telling civil servants how they thought it was. And actually, on one such occasion, a formal complaint was lodged. And we were all really shocked. We were just like kind of...
But who? Which way round was it the complaint?
No, it was the civil servant lodged a formal complaint about the academics' opinions of her futures work. And I think we sort of said, oh, well, we think your work is very jargony and we don't really understand what's at the heart of it. But we might not have used those sort of we don't understand type softening words. So we apologised. I mean, we had not wanted to hurt this person's feelings, but we couldn't understand what it was she was doing. So that's the huge difference. And I can sort of see myself slowly kind of being hauled into the sort of gravity of the gravitational field of thou shalt not say what one really thinks. But I'm hoping that I won't actually sort of collapse into it before I've finished.
Aren't there different ways of saying what you really think? Isn't it partly...
I have a book. I wish I brought my book with me. My first notebook in the Ministry of Defence, I used to keep a list of them. So, of course, the one was consider it done. You know what consider it done means? Consider it done is, yes, you've told us, we're never going to do that, and we're hoping you're going to forget. Another one was, what was another one? Thank you for that very full description. That means, oh my God, I thought you'd never shut up. And so on. I have yes, there are, and if you don't know, yes, it's another language. And I refuse to speak that language. I think in a way, do you know the one I really hate, actually? The one I really hate is I agree with everything that's been said.
Ah, yeah.
Because to me, the implications of that are, I haven't really listened to what you said because I don't care, and now I'm going to tell you what I think anyway. And I think behind the politeness, there is a reticence for real debate that I think is unhelpful. But there's also this incredible importance of building consensus in order to do delivery. Because actually that's really what the civil service is there for, is to deliver decisions that have been made. And if you spend all your life arguing about the details, you won't deliver anything.
And that's the civil service, but of course you're also dealing with politicians from a very wide range of backgrounds, and you've including a science minister who was previously the chief scientist. So how do you find engaging with ministers who have such a wide range of frameworks? John Major's government, the first one I served in, had got in his government a fellow of all souls, and he himself had left school with an unspecified number of O-levels and some A-levels. But it was just such a range. How do you find that?
Well, I like that challenge. I mean, I think in my heart, I'm really a teacher. Obviously, I mean, a teacher in a university, which is a very particular kind of teaching. But nevertheless, I really relish the sort of challenge of trying to make it feel to anybody that they can ask any question. And I'm not going to be horrible. I'm not going to say, God, which I never would. Yeah. I never, ever would. And actually, I think that's one of the things that is becoming a better habit of ours, is to make time sometimes to talk to people one-on-one, so they don't have to feel worried about what will their colleagues think either. And actually, I think it's a very strong story that Patrick used to tell about going to see the then Prime Minister with a couple of scientists to talk about climate change. Nobody else in the room. So total safe space, you ask whatever you like. And I think we should do more of that, actually.
Patrick, of course, got to know ministers and the political process through that intense crisis of COVID. And in my experience, often it's when the chief scientist is summoned because of some unexpected event with significant scientific assessment needed, be it Fukushima or the Iceland volcano, and suddenly it's the chief scientist moment in Cobra or in cabinet. Share us the challenges that you faced at the more urgent end of the scale when you suddenly found yourself briefing ministers on something that's blown up?
So they're all things that haven't blown up. So they're all things where we've done some of the steps of being ready and they haven't yet blown up. So one is MPOX, and that's actually, I wanted to use that as an example. I think that's quite an interesting example of actually what is the one-to-one process. So that wasn't just me, that was me and Chris Whitty were there, and lots of people from UKHSA. But the process is, it's all quite sort of, you go downstairs in a building and you hand over all your tech and you go through a special door and you're never allowed to mention the fact that this meeting existed, so I'm not telling you its name. And then you have a very sensible discussion about what you're going to do. And our job, I think, falls mainly into two parts. There's what I might call sort of naming of parts. So for MPOX, it's making clear to everybody, look, we already have MPOX in this country. It's a particular sort of family of MPOX. That's called a clade. Clade 2b is what's already here. Clade 1b is what we're worried about. Try and get that right. And if it's confusing in a document, it may well be that the person who wrote the document has got it wrong, actually. So all those sorts of things that you would, in any teaching setting, do. And then also, the much bigger picture about, well, why is this a problem now? Why is this weird new thing a problem and it didn't used to be? So that's also interesting. And then, of course, there's lots of operational stuff, like how much vaccine should we buy? What's the right amount of vaccine we should buy? And that's less my bag because that sits right inside the HSC. So MPOX, we're all a bit worried about Marburg at the minute. Many of you could explain better than me that there's a lot of slightly nervous-making space weather at the minute. So I get little sort of WhatsApp saying, we've sent you an email, you might want to read it, about space weather. So those are the things. And then, of course, the other thing I talk about that comes up with resilience is COVID inquiry. So every time a COVID inquiry module reports back, that sets quite an interesting discussion off about, right, okay, how much of this do we think we've already done? How much of it are we going to do? What's our response going to be? So I would say it's the government ministers involved in resilience who are the ones I see the most of.
Very interesting. Now, you mentioned operational stuff. I have now to pause to make an operational announcement, which is the reason we couldn't get Slido to function, is the number on the screen is the wrong number. So I'm now going to tell, especially for our online participants, the right number, which is hashtag 3836549. I'm going to say it again slowly. 3836549. And I hope then we'll try to get our Slido function up and operating. You've had, of course, also a change of government and the arrival of the Labour government with their 5 missions. How does science and tech fit into that, and how have you managed to get the science, the scientific expertise and the wider contribution that science can make plugged into the mission agenda?
So when the missions were announced and the sort of architecture about how each one would have an SRO, a senior responsible officer, in Whitehall departments, yes, they are all in Whitehall departments, I wrote to all those SROs and said, I hope you're going to have a CSA on your board, and I think it should be this one, or for some of them I said, I think you need these 2 CSAs. And they have all been taken up, so that was accepted. So every board has a CSA on there, and that CSA's job then is, first of all, to help the board figure out how it can use existing science, is there some new science that they need to gather, and we, along with the analysts in government, are very interested in what metrics they're going to design. So that's sort of straight into the board, but that CSA's other job is to come back to the rest of the CSA network and say, here's what we're talking about, here's what we're beginning to land on specific things we would hope to deliver under this mission. So there we feel, I think, well embedded. I was very relieved that my suggestion that a CSA should be on each board was accepted. It's a very obvious thing to do, but nevertheless, it is nice when somebody does the thing that you think is obvious. I think that's working well, largely, I would say, because the CSA network is tied, basically, because we are all strangers in a strange land. You know, none of us, well, a tiny number of the CSAs are actually permanent civil service servants, but most of us are academics come into the civil service temporarily, some people from business into academia temporarily, and so we're all of us going through this sort of culture shock of gosh, how does it actually work? So, and I think that rather helps us knit together as a network, and we are, you know, we do have sort of a common purpose.
And of course, the network of chief science advisors is another great kind of cross-governmental structure. And when you're trying to get a message across government, getting all the chief scientists to understand it and share it, transmit it, is very powerful. And you are still having weekly meetings?
Yeah, we meet we meet once a week. So we met this morning, actually, to talk about phase 2 SR bids. Yes, we meet every week. Actually, we just had our, we go away twice a year. So we were in Edinburgh a couple of weeks ago for a few days, actual face-to-face time. We actually genuinely like each other. Because well, I mean, it's one of the best groups of people I've ever worked with, I must say. I really appreciate the time I spend with the CSAs.
And they have varying relationships with ministers. There's some CSAs you can sense are absolutely key policy advisors in the minister's office all the time. There are others where when you're not quite so sure how strong the access is. How do you help out in those circumstances?
Always trying, pushing. So one of the so whenever when new posts come up, reminding departments that their CSA ought to be advising their minister, not some other person. A powerful CSA isn't always a blessing to a department. I think.
And why is that?
Oh, well, because they ask awkward questions. They're not part of some network of sort of career advancement. You know, they're all. You know, we're there to be awkward. And I mean, I think actually, I think the thing we have in common is that we're one of the things we're there for is to defend the future, because it is so hard to spend money on things that you know you're going to need in the future. And that's one of the reasons most CSAs have no operational responsibility. So, you know, if you don't have to buy the, let's say, the Mpox vaccine, it's easier to say, no, I'm going to invest in the new class of vaccines that is going to absolutely revolutionize the way we do vaccination in 5-10 years' time. But that's you know, it's a tension. And that's, I think that's one of the reasons why it is actually pretty important that CSAs should be external.
And does that sort of define the future, which is a great way of putting it, does that also include pressing for science in a delicate public expenditure negotiations? And we've got 2 stages over the next few months?
Very much so, yes. Very much so. I mean, my job is to press for the science across the piece. And because I don't really have a budget, I mean, you know, I have 180 people, but that's it. I am a trusted voice to say, here are some bits that fit together well, not quite sure where this bit fits. But I mean, mostly our voices at the moment is don't cut the R&D budget. That would be a foolish move.
And the science advice you're giving, I mean, there is this program asking departments to identify areas of research interest, which, as I understand, it carries on and is being extended. And it certainly used to be the case that this very useful exercise, a surprising number of the questions were ultimately social science questions. Well, there was a lot of understanding behavior, understanding the wider environment. The network of chief scientists is not particularly, there's not a particularly large cadre of social scientists within that. How do you decide on the balance of disciplines, and how do you ensure that the social science needed to answer a lot of these questions is available alongside all the other forms of scientific expertise?
So I think I could probably name 4 of my CSAs who are social scientists at the moment, actually, or social and behavioural scientists, which out of 20 I think isn't bad, actually.
That is better than it is.
And they actually organise themselves into a sort of special interest group and bring along other people from within the civil service, particularly thinking about resilience. So as part of our continuous work to be ready in case SAGE gets called tomorrow. So that's always there. Quite a lot of our roundtables are social science. For exactly the reason that you raised, that so many of the questions that government asks are social and behavioural science questions. A lot of the work that we were doing, I mean, another whole set of things that we were really very worried about over the course of the summer was the situation with prisons, which eventually became very public. But there was quite a lot of preparatory work went in based on the fact that we knew that the prisons were getting very, very full. And that was fundamentally, that was all behavioural science. Right. I hadn't understood, I must say, I had not understood that there isn't very much behavioural science in government. I just assumed, I don't know what, I just assumed that there was masses and masses of expertise in behavioural science amongst the civil service. And given how useful the answers we bring from our behavioural science subgroup is, I think there's not as much expertise as I thought there was.
And do you find in general, do you think levels of expertise in the civil service? I mean, Patrick has had in the past ambitions for the patterns of recruitment, particularly people from a scientific background, into the general civil service. Is that being delivered? Is there more still to be done?
There's lots more to be done. So there's our sort of flagship recruitment process is this thing called the fast stream. So there's mainstream fast stream that does recruit some scientists. There's also a special thing called the science and engineering fast stream that we certainly have a lot to do with in Go Science that continues. And that's a great way of bringing in people sometimes straight after a first degree. Many of them will have done a PhD or even a postdoc. We're actually working, sort of continuing this enduring topic, I think, about how do we help the civil service itself become more scientific. Yeah. We're working to make a programme to get people much later in their career to come and be civil servants. So not instead of CSAs, it's different from the CSAs. So it's people who will come having done maybe 10, 15 years as a university academic or in one of our own PSREs, public sector research establishments, or in our dreams in industry, and bring that real depth of knowledge with them, but then become a policy generalist. because the power in the civil service lies in policy. And a lot of policy making is actually quite like science, in fact. And at the moment, that sort of flow doesn't seem to work, and I think we need to make it work. So I know people from what were my labs at DSTL who I think would be fantastic policy generalists. But they need to accept that they've missed, in learning how to be a very good scientist, they've missed a big chunk of the training of a young civil servant that we will have to help them catch up.
And do you think that also they are willing to accept the limitations of information and analysis if you are functioning in Whitehall, and the limitations of time? I sometimes say that often in government you're more like a GP than a hospital consultant, taking decisions with limited information and limited time. And I think sometimes the cultural pressures is scientists accepting that decisions have to be taken under those constraints. Can that cultural gap be bridged?
Yes, by some people. Some people hate it, and some people revel in it. And there are quite a lot of secondment schemes. So I think we would probably say to most people, well, you should probably try it before you leave the academic world or the government lab world that you love, because I'm not sure you can know before you do it whether you're going to love the urgency and the fact that, something is actually going to happen of a delivery role. And that's one of the things we're going to do, is find some of the people go back to some of the people who've done secondments and said, did you like it? Do you want us to help you to find a permanent job in the civil service? And our offer is then going to be some form of, and we will then look after you, because we had a very Sarah Chater is in the audience here. We had a terrific roundtable discussion about this a couple of weeks ago, where we figured out that it's not the first job that matters, it's the second job.
Right.
So it's once we sort of can try and get these people to a stage where they would actually win a competition inside the civil service.
So you're actively designing these type of career options and routes,
yes,
which will be public information and easily accessible and understood.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Yes. And actually, I was really encouraged by how many people who are not in the civil service filled in we sent out a survey to find out, well, does anybody want this? And more than 500 people filled the survey in. So there are people out there who, many of whom have spent time in the civil service and would like to be civil servants. And it's not easy to get into the civil service.
No, and there's various constraints about whether, first of all, existing officials get first option on any vacancy that arrives, and you're wrestling with all those type of issues at the moment, aren't you?
And I think one of the other things we should be doing is thinking about the civil servants we've already got, so people who've come into the fast stream from science background, and making sure that we don't lose them, and that they think of themselves as scientists, they stay in touch a bit with their science, stay in touch with the science community in government, but also mostly it's sort of like a passport. There's this sort of set of things you have to have if you're going to be a senior civil servant, and that we need. I mean, this isn't really something I can do, but there are people I work with who can do it. Make sure that we have people coming through with a very strong background who get appointed into the very senior roles. Yeah,
excellent. Excellent. And of course, organisations like CSAP and there are other organisations that try to make those type of connections. We ought to focus briefly on some of the government-specific priorities, and one of the messages that comes across very clearly is using science and tech to improve public services, a particular focus on AI and data, but wider than that. I mean, how do you think we're doing at harnessing science and tech and our own research base to deliver better public services and including perhaps better public services even when they're operating under very serious resource constraints? People like Peter Kyle would say that this was a high priority. How are you getting on delivering that? What more needs to be done?
I think learning from each other is the thing that needs to be done. It's something I find, having come from an academic background, it's one of the things I find a little bit strange about the civil service, is I don't see as much learning from each other as you do in academia. I mean, let's face it, in academia, we have a whole system for nicking each other's ideas, but you have to do it with accreditation. And because they don't have accreditation in the civil service, there's sort of not much motivation to have people nick your ideas, which I think is a bit of a problem, actually. So there sort of aren't weekly seminar series. There isn't a seminar series in the civil service for all the people who work on quantum. There's loads of people who work on quantum, and they do know each other quite well, actually, but they don't get together and say, look, here's this amazing paper, what can we do with this? And that is a surprise to me. So I think we should do more of that. And the reason that's an answer to your question is, look what DWP are doing with modern AI. So somewhere down the line, DWP must have sorted their data out. I don't know when that happened, but they must have done. And this is all done, interestingly, this is all done inside analysis. It doesn't get called science in the civil service. So I mean, actually, I think my career, mathematical modelling of infectious disease outbreaks would probably have been called analysis if I'd been a civil servant, not a scientist at all. But that's fine. I'm not too bothered about what things are called. DWP had their data in shape so they could roll out several really fantastic tools over their data. One of which, for example, instead of if I'm the person come into the DWP office and you're the person who's there to help me, instead of you having to spend your whole time like this trying to figure out which of the, I don't know what it is, but tens of thousands of pages are germane to me, there's a very nice analysis that will give you, these are the 3 questions you must ask Angela today, get the answers to those 3 questions, and we will then be able to help her better. So you and I can then have a conversation about 3 questions.
Right.
So it's about letting one person have a better interaction with another person rather than struggling to understand the enormity of DWP's rules.
And this is based on analysing, just listening to the words, just analysing what's said? This is based on what's submitted in advance? How does that work?
Yeah. So it's based on a model of DWP's tens of thousands of pages rules. And then what I've submitted in advance. Right. So can you imagine that then places me somewhere in that model and says, in order for us to work out more things about Angela and how we can help her, here are the most important 3 bits of information.
Right. And do you think, I mean, there are always individual examples. The challenge is ensuring that across government, these types of initiatives work. Do you think that the arrangements for sharing information, sharing understanding on good practice, ensuring that what you're describing in the DWP also happens in a GP surgery, that some of it also happens in a classroom, although that kind of capacity to take these crucial areas of technical advance and apply them across the public services, have we got that in place? What more do we need to do? So
I think we don't have enough of that in place. So actually my friend Steve Riley and so Steve Riley is in, I think, probably the DG for analysis, I would guess, in UKHSA. We have a group, we call it Work in Progress, which is people who are trying to use very modern AI in a government department. And we try very hard, we beg people, please don't bring lines to take. Don't want to hear any lines to take. We just want you to talk to each other about how difficult it is, and it is difficult. And it's difficult because the data tends to be a mess. Yeah. And I think I can say uncontroversially that the government IT estate is a mess. And mostly we sort of commiserate with each other about how difficult it is, but also people talk to each other about how they've got round things, basically. And then the thing that's a bit heartbreaking is that when one department has solved a really important problem, I hardly dare tell you what a really important problem is, but let's say, for example, answering letters to the public in some reasonably automated way. Although the ideas of how they did it can be shifted to another department, the code can't, because the IT setup is just so completely different. And the thing we're desperately, desperately short of is basically software engineers to implement these things. I think there's a bit of sort of rationalisation coming. So with DSIT getting the job of being at the heart of digital delivery, I'm very much hoping that they're going to be a bit more muscular and say, I don't care what you want, you're having this, because for you all to have the same thing means that when one of you solves a problem, the other can adopt it.
Right, very interesting. And do you think in terms of DCIT and the science base, there's clearly a focus on AI. I think perhaps, I don't want to overinterpret, but I think my reading of where Patrick Vallance is as science minister, including going way back, drawing on his experiences at GSK, he's quite interested in the application of science. He would probably say that we need to focus more on turning the curiosity-driven research into something that's useful and applicable. Does that in turn feed into questions such as how UKRI should best operate, what the priorities are for funding? If you really want to do things like harness AI and use data and get more software engineers, does that have implications for the shape of the science base and how it's funded?
I think they do. So I think I think these are DCIT decisions about how much curiosity-based research do we want done, and how we're going to make sure that UKRI is left alone to run that, and how do we want to organise ourselves to exploit the fruits of that research, either to make government and other things run better, and more importantly, to drive growth and prosperity. So one of the things that we're all very relieved about is that this thing called the S&T framework that Patrick worked so hard to get agreed across government, which is basically, I mean, I used to call it, it's a recipe, basically, to turn brilliant ideas into prosperity. It's sort of all the things that government has to fix. So it's got things like skills and infrastructure. Yeah. I won't give you the S&T framework lecture. That has survived. It's morphed into a checklist. But that's sort of what it was anyway, so that's fine. So one of the many terrific things about having Patrick back as minister is that shared piece of work that lots and lots of people across government bought into. In fact, I mean, one of the most brilliant things Patrick did is that pretty much everybody in government thinks they wrote the S&T framework. In fact, I must remember that trick. So lots of people really like the S&T framework. It's pretty darn sensible, and it lives on. Where we're trying to get into now is the industrial strategy. So basically, as the cross-cutting sort of facilitators of the industrial strategy, they've invented their own, which are of course the same because but that does. So we then say to them, well, hold on a minute, where's regulation in your cross-cutting things? And they say, oh yeah, regulation. You know, there is a list of 10 of these things.
Yes, there is, and we've indeed had Patrick here talking about his framework, and it's great to hear that it carries on. And you think that departments, and of course departments have their own R&D budgets. There have been, historically the problem has been that often the R&D budgets get cut, the departmental R&D budgets get cut, especially if a department is under pressure to deliver services today. And then the science budget gets expected to do all the applied R&D side that was supposed to be a departmental budget for. And then within the science budget, you have a massive argument about the extent to which you're funding curiosity-driven research and the extent to which you're actually using ESRC
You're right, from my memoir from my time at MAD.
to sort of do the research that the Department for Education isn't commissioning but ought to be commissioning. How are you finding all those kind of conversations going?
We all know that issue. The main thing we can hope to do with that is have the R&D budget that goes from Treasury to departments ring-fenced.
Right.
So that when CSAs are fighting to defend the R&D budget, they can say, I'll get Treasury in. Which actually works weirdly well. You never actually have to get Treasury in. You just have to say, I'll get Treasury in. I used to say, I'll get Treasury in or I'll go to Patrick. And I always won. It's interesting. So now I say to people, I'm assuming I will never actually have to go somewhere and say something. So that's one step.
Yeah.
That looks after your R&D budget. But then, of course, there is also the split of how much of your R&D budget, basically how you TRL splitting your R&D budget, and then there's the dreaded tuck under, where somebody
tucking under, what an innocuous expression for such a scary Whitehall device.
That's where somebody comes along and says, oh, you know your S&T budget, you can have Tempest. Yes. And that's, that would just, which I would say, no, thank you. I mean, I was lucky in the MOD in that some time ago, a commitment had been made in writing that 1.2% of the defence budget would be spent on science and technology under the control of the CSA, and if it ever fell below that, some question would have to be asked in Parliament, and the government chief scientific advisor would have words. And that was unbelievably powerful, actually, and I think we should try and get more of those written. Every time any department thinks, oh yeah, we do need more S&T, we should try and get them to write those sorts of things down.
Yeah, well, more power to her on that, because that is so important, and it is an endless source of frustration. And we understand the pressure that individual departments are under, but the more that the centre protects the R&D element of each departmental spend.
I do not resent the fact that I had to defend the future in MOD. You know, I mean, MOD needed more money than it had, and it looked to them like I had a lot of money. And whilst I mean, the main person I was in tension with over that is the person who does a job called in charge of military capability, so basically chief shopper. You know, we were always in tension, but I mean, he was a wonderful, wonderful engineer, a man called Richard Knight, and he's now chief of the air staff. And I thought, frankly, I thought that was right, that he would be endlessly saying, are you sure you're not wasting that? And I would be saying, and I would be held to account, say, no, I'm not wasting it. Look, this with that.
Very good. Now, I think there's so many other questions I could be asking, but I think we must give the audience here an opportunity to put some questions to you. And while they do that, I'm also going to try to get back onto Slido after my failure before to see if we can't now ensure that our online participants have an opportunity as well. So let's start with some questions on this side. I think, do identify yourselves, but I think Graham Reed has got his hand up in the central area. Yes, so Graham, and we might then take a couple more questions. Yes.
Thank you. I'd like to ask about the assimilation of scientific advice with other sources of advice. Because ministers will be getting something that might include legal, economic, and departmental policy advice. Do you try to assimilate the scientific perspective before it goes to the minister, or do you go in with a separate strand of advice?
So, I mean, let's just talk about COVID, because that was such a sort of strong-lived experience. The way we did it then was that we had the scientific advice coming in from one side and the economic advice coming in from the other side. I don't really think it worked, actually. I think we ended up sort of standing on opposite sides of a chasm, as though it was either the economy or the population's health, and actually that wasn't right. And I have reached out, I need to do more work with Treasury about how we do that sort of work together. I mean, the creation of counterfactuals is a very difficult job for government. OBR does actually do quite a lot of it, and I haven't sort of, it's something I do feel quite strongly about, and I haven't really figured out how to do it yet. I think it is, at the end of the day, I don't think what we want is a huge, great mathematical model that goes, whack, here you go, Minister, here's the answer. But I think the fact that there was very little conversation between the sort of sciencey, experty bit of government, including lots of advisors, and the economic-y bit, was actually rather damaging for us all. I think at the end of the day, those trade-offs are exactly what we pay politicians to do. So I would at some stage say, no, I think I would be more with, here's what the science says, here's what economics says, here's what the law says, go figure.
Yeah, no, that is so true, and there is not a coherent, single, commensable structure for analysis. Now, I'm pleased to report that for our online participants, that on the new number, I have now been able to access questions on Slido, and of course, we will be carrying on for the people physically here over dinner. So I'm going to take a couple of questions that of the many that have come in on Slido. I mean, one interesting question, where I'm going to try to bunch them up, is is what's the relationship between you and the government's National Technology Advisor? Because, of course, for a time, Patrick had both roles, but he always said he wanted them to be divided up. And so that's one question. And then, secondly, what about should there be a separate Chief Innovation Advisor, areas of innovation interest? So just tell us what your responsibility is time with technology and innovation.
So, indeed, roughly speaking, Angela plus Dave equals Patrick. So the way Dave, so Dave Smith, the National Technology Advisor, long and distinguished career in Rolls-Royce, holds a PhD, was an academic, and then went off to work at Rolls-Royce. I think he started his career at the STL, actually, which is always a good sign from my point of view. The way we cut it is, so first of all, there's the sort of Go Science DSIT cut. So if it's about science advice for policy, it should probably be us. If it's about the policy for science, it'll be DSIT. Of course, that cut is not absolute, and there's lots of overlap, and we often work together, but that's roughly the starting point. And then the other way Dave and I cut it is that if it's something about universities and reaching out to universities for help, it's Angela, and if it's something about business and reaching out to businesses for help, it's Dave. And I would say so far with that and the fact that, well, I think he's terrific, that's worked rather well, I feel. I think having a National Technology Advisor is terrific, and I think I'm not entirely sure why the National Technology Advisor might be a good person to handle innovation. So, no, I'm not gagging to have a Chief Innovation Advisor, I must say.
Right. Then one more question, then I'll come back to the whole. But this has been upvoted a lot from Sally Bailey. What one thing can scientists do to ensure their research has real policy impact?
Really think about what you're saying. This came from, I won't say who, a minister in a department I know well, so second-hand, really a bit fed up with people coming and talking to him in acronyms that he doesn't understand. I mean, these are not, these are clever people, but they don't live in our world. And, you know, and we do use jargon. I think we have to put our hands up and say, I mean, you know, I joked about civil service being another language, but so is ours. And I mean, I think that would be the first thing I would say, but because there's so much to lose by not speaking a language that a well-educated, sensible person can follow. And that might require practice, actually. You know, you might need to go and practice on somebody who's not a scientist and say, does that make sense?
I think, could you add to that list as well? I would say often the rewards in science are for innovation in methodology, showing some ingenious way in which you've extracted more information from a data set that already exists or something. And often the first half of the paper is about the methodology, in which people are very proud, but often for a lay user, the methodology is not particularly of interest or irrelevant. So you find yourself flicking through page after page. And another feature is that because, again, it's incentive structure we've created through things like the REF, it's the new tiny little bit of new extra stuff that gets the reward in the research incentive system. Whereas often a magisterial review of exactly what we know at the moment, a summation for a lay user of where the current balance of understanding is much more useful. But I think it's true to say we haven't created an incentive structure which rewards that type of scientific output.
No, I think that's right. Actually, so my great friend Charles Godfrey and I spent quite a lot of time working on producing things that we called restatements, which were precisely that.
Yep.
So here's basically a list of things we know.
Yeah.
I live in hope that before too long, generating those is going to be a lot easier. It's the sort of thing that generative AI, trained on the right subset of the published literature, ought to do well. It's not there yet. And I completely agree. But I mean, most of us who work in universities, I agree, we're completely obsessed on the new thing. I mean, I don't work in university anymore, but you know, that's the obsession of any researcher. But actually, most of us are also teachers, and know that you need to, first of all, share the corpus of existing work, and also that the students that we teach, they don't know why all this is interesting. So I thought, because I agree, what you might call the standing crop of knowledge, but also, well, so what?
Yep.
I used to say there were two things that I felt I could have sort of had a stamp made of when I co-chaired SPI-EM, so that was the modelling subgroup of SAGE. One was, stop talking now, nobody cares. So, you know, they would go off on one about something that was probably quite important, but they weren't going to solve in a year, so I didn't want to know. And the other was, they would say, oh, no, that's just obvious, we shouldn't say that. And I said, no, that is not obvious. And I think, and so I think also asking those questions is actually, you know, like you do when you're teaching, what is it that this audience needs to know?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Let's collect a couple more questions from the floor. Yes, I think in the middle. Yes. There's a lady who's now waving at you, Gavin. Yes. Yep. There you are. And we're going to collect a couple and probably do 3 in a row, I think. Yes.
Thank you. And thank you to you both for a really great conversation. I'm Sarah Chater from UCL. I also co-chair the University Policy Engagement Network, and I'm a trustee of the British Science Association. And Angela, I wanted to ask a question about the changing landscape of government across the UK with the creation of new combined authorities and so on. What are your thoughts on the opportunities to build greater scientific advisory capacity at a subnational level?
Yeah, really interesting question.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to collect a couple more just to gain time. So behind you, Gavin, yeah, there's a couple of hands up there. Yeah.
Thank you. Andrew Mackenzie from the Physiological Society. DSIT is still a relatively new department, so I'd be interested on your reflections on how that's changed the perception of science within government.
Right, and then the gentleman nearby, I think, yep.
My question is about DSIT has just been created, or it was created a little while ago now. If you had a blank canvas, what would the UK's science and tech ecosystem look like if you could create it from scratch? Would it look like what we've got today? And if there's a gap, why?
Right. So I think there are all 3 questions about kind of patterns of responsibility, both devolved and at national level.
Yes. So devolved, yes, I think it would be great if there were chief scientists in those bits of... So the devolved administrations do have chief scientists. They sit in the CSA network with us. I think it'd be great to see the metro cities and those places have chief scientists. And, of course, they could teach us a lot about whole systems integration. When you hear them talking, you think, oh, you're already doing that. So I think there would be a lot of interest in that. There would be a rather different sort of job, wouldn't it? It would be, I think it's a great idea. How has DSIT changed the perception of science and government? I'm almost inclined to ask Paul Monks this, because he's CSA Bay, so he lived the change. Gosh, what do I... So DSIT was created just before I became GCSA. So I've never been GCSA pre-DSIT. And, of course, when I was in MOD, ashamed to say all I really cared about was either MOD or COVID. I think, I mean, the big change is COVID. That was what made this massive, massive change in the way science is perceived in government. I think having a Secretary of State for Science, though, is really important. The fact that there is somebody always at Cabinet whose job is science, innovation and technology, I think really, really matters. And gosh, if I had tabula rasa, do you know, isn't that funny? I've never thought about that. Help me, David, what would we do? Gosh. Well, we would do more about these sorts of, we would be more thoughtful about what do we reward. I mean, this is me channeling UKRI and Otley.
I mean, there's an endless dilemma in government because you have to have boundaries somewhere. You can't just have one great big single government department. And so as soon as you define a boundary, you create a set of issues. And I suppose historically you could say we had for 50 years DSIR, which looks a lot like DSIT does together. DSIR created at the end of the First World War. and actually abolished by the new Labour government of Harold Wilson in 1965 on the argument that science and tech in its own little department was not properly linked to business and application and industry. So it was brought into MinTech, which was going to be a broader based link between the science and the technology community. Now, then you have your own set of dilemmas, and the new argument from Rishi Sunak, above all, was that we need particularly a department solely and specifically doing science and research. But I think then the challenge is to ensure that it works very closely with the applied departments, the business and trade department, and also DESNES. So there's never a right answer, but you try to make the arrangements work. And I do think that having a cabinet minister speaking up for science and tech in the cabinet is a fantastic opportunity. I have to say, in a way, I did have that opportunity myself, but it's not always, and that was partly just because David Cameron had decided it should work like that, and it didn't always work like that subsequently. So I think, and the challenge of using DSIT's expertise to deliver science and tech across public services, I think, is a really important one. Now we're going to let's collect. Oh, we've got some other. Now there's a hand up there, and then we'll come down to the margins there. Yep.
Thank you, Peter Marsh, Made Here Now. As you look ahead and you look at some of the areas of science and technology that you've got to wrestle with, climate change, nuclear, AI, where do you think is going to be the biggest fights, the biggest battles to put your point of view against entrenched interests who might be arguing the opposite?
Okay. When you mean within government, the science and tech perspective? Right. And I think let's collect another question there.
Thank you. Helen Ferrier, I'm the Chief Science Advisor for the National Farmers Union. And I was just wondering how we get small and micro businesses, I guess like farms or food businesses that have a big impact on social and environmental issues. How do we get them to engage in evidence to improve their decision making and ideally their performance?
Yes, and now let me add a couple of online questions in this same area. How can a CSA encourage every department to consistently employ evidence-based policy? And there's also a question whether you think we do need to, let's put it very frankly, does the role of a CSA include meddling when ministers have made evidence-free decisions? So this question of which I think goes back to Peter's challenge.
Yes. Gosh, I'm not sure I can remember these. What was the first one?
Well, yeah, Peter was saying if you think there are big issues coming up where you have to make sure that the science and technological angle perspective is at the table, and I think that links to the anxiety. What about decisions that may be taken without sufficient science? Taking that partly is just standing for empiricism.
I am both optimistic and concerned about the decisions that we will make to get us to net zero in 2050. I think there's a very, very difficult decisions to make that will have to be made with uncertainty. With Paul Monks, we do have rather a good network across government it's called the Net Zero Innovation Board. So it's about where shall we invest government money in R&D to get us there. It is very helpful to know where the there is. So at least we've got that. We know where we're trying to be and when. And with that, it is nevertheless still very difficult. I'm worried that we will lose edge in bits of science and technology where we currently have edge because of our current fiscal constraints. That's more of a sort of, the trouble is you can lose edge in just a year or so. I think those are two things that, one, I sort of see what I see what we're trying to do about it. The other is rather out of my hands, and I am worried about what am I going to be able to do if bad decisions are made that way.
Yeah.
Farmers. farmers are very good at adopting some tech. I once ran a program that was about the genetics of scrapie, basically. And my goodness, sheep breeders know their genetics. And we had no problem at all with them. Well, I mean, we did pay for a lot of it, but they were very, very keen to have whole flocks of sheep genotyped. So I was actually pretty impressed at the genetic expertise in sheep breeding. I mean, obviously, perhaps thinking about it now, you'd expect that. If you're an animal breeder, of course you know your genetics. What else could we do? Maybe we should have more science and technology at farm shows. There are, I mean, it's a funny life being a farm. It's quite lonely. So a lot of them do go to farm shows. And actually, I mean, BBSRC is always very good at being at them, actually. But maybe we should have more innovation stalled, shown off at farm shows. At our robot roundtable at the beginning of this week, I was roundly put in my place for saying it was quite difficult to get robots into Whitehall, so maybe they're not as movable as people say they are, by the person who said, no, there's plenty of robots all over the farms getting on doing stuff. So my understanding is that adoption of robot technology is coming along. I'll be very interested to hear if that's your view. Make it, they are indeed lots of rather isolated small businesses, aren't they? And so I think that's the way to think about them. My sense was that if you made the price right and go to the agricultural show, actually, literally, you have to stand back and not get crushed in the rush. So I'm hopeful, but I agree, helping people use evidence to make the right purchasing decisions ought to be something that we make sure happens. Now then,
thank you.
Two listy ones. There were two listy questions that I've now forgotten.
I think you've done pretty well on the. I think you can regard your obligations as being. You're so scrupulous. You're so unlike a politician. You're so scrupulous. Because I'm going to move on to the strand of questioning that's come up online, which we haven't yet covered, and that's really about science communication, looking out beyond advice to ministers. So Cleo from the British Science Association said, could there be an ambition to embed science engagement and communication skills in CSA's work so that in turn how science and tech has informed government decisions is communicated publicly? And then one specific question, how does the government address concerns about transparency, explainability? People are very worried sometimes about AI being used in public services. What is going to be publicly explained about that? So perhaps a bit about the outward-facing part of the job.
I'm all in favour of communications asked for from the CSAs. I think they're very good at it myself, and I'd be happy for them to do more in a very sensible way. I'm not in a tearing hurry to go back to a lot of podiums and 5 p.m. presses. I just don't think. I think in retrospect that didn't work out terribly well. But I think we probably could have more discussion about how science is fitting in to the task of policy making. And maybe I'm not sure how we could make that interesting enough for the public to really want to read about it. I mean, I suspect it's a slightly specialist sport. I mean, I find it very interesting, but I'm not sure everybody does, unless we're in some terrible crisis when people do find it interesting. Maybe that's the answer. Maybe the answer is to, when you go into a crisis, know that you will have to do very good comms, use the relationships that we've already built. Personally, I think the specialist press in the UK played an absolutely fantastic game during COVID, worked very, very hard to get the science right. I mean, I will never forget the day I opened a tabloid paper, I think it was probably the Daily Mail, and there in the middle was an explanation of this is what your immune system is made up of and this is how it works, that had been written by the Daily Mail health correspondent, and I think Peter Openshaw. I mean, it was a beautiful thing. So, yeah, let's use the crises as they come along as an opportunity to let people know how science is being used to do this thing that we need right now.
Yes, and this is a pre-COVID example and minor by comparison, but the during the height of the Fukushima crisis, when several other Western countries were pulling all their diplomats out of Tokyo, we had the advice of the chief scientist was that there was not a significant risk of radiation in Tokyo, and it wasn't the British Foreign Secretary saying it's okay to stay. The chief scientist was put up to say it was his advice that it was safe to stay, and on that basis we were not recommending British citizens leave Tokyo. And the Japanese were so impressed that we had this trusted independent voice. At that point, the Japanese government subsequently decided they needed a chief scientist function, because they needed someone who could communicate with that authority publicly in a way that an individual minister couldn't. And it is a reminder, as you rightly say, it's often in a crisis that the power of that voice comes through.
And John Beddington, who was the GCSA at the time, tells sort of pretty chillingly the moment when the Prime Minister at the time, who I think would have been David Cameron,
Yes, it was.
Said to him, "Are you sure, John?"
Yeah.
And John said, "Yes, I'm sure." And he said, "Are you sure you're sure?"
Yeah. Yes, he came to Cabinet. I can remember that discussion, and it was the Chief Science advice that shifted the Cabinet's view about what the British position should be in that crisis. And of course, it was also partly that he was then also going to be publicly responsible for it. It was, yeah.
And fortunately, it wasn't really a borderline decision. It was pretty clear.
But it was a different decision than some other governments were taking.
Well, and
that
if you ask
involved-
John, I mean, I've talked to John about this quite a lot, actually. He rang the French to say, "Why are you telling people to leave? Is there some other, are you analysing some other science?" And they said, no, we agree with you, basically.
Very interesting. So we've got, there's a bit of this kind of application versus pure science debate that we got into a little bit earlier. Do you feel that your role includes backing the funding of basic science without immediate human implication? And how does this mesh with UKRI's role for government? This endless dilemma of what the balance is between immediate comprehensible application and so-called curiosity-driven research that may be of enormous value in the future, but we don't know today.
Yes, I definitely have a role in backing the ongoing funding of curiosity-driven research. It is the goose that lays the golden egg. In those days when we used to have to stand up and say we're going to be a scientific superpower in 2030 and sort of slightly curl our toes, the reason we could do that is that, we are flipping good at basic research. We're just plain good at it. I think it's something to do with the way we organise our education in our universities, myself. And we mustn't lose that. And that makes this question very difficult, especially as we sit in a time with not enough money to go around.
Yeah. And there is a real danger. And of course, one understands the argument, first of all, got to take the pain, and then after you've done the measures necessary to take the pain, you can then grow and move up. But if in the meanwhile you lose some capabilities, the growing up stage later on is very hard to deliver. If for a year or two you've lost capability. Let's collect some more questions from here. Yes. So we've got a lot of questions. They're all on this side. There's a group. Pause, Gavin. Yeah, right. We'll start here. Yeah.
Thanks, David. Another David. David Cope from Cambridge University. I think within your department, you also have responsibility for the government foresight programme. Do you have any aspirations for it? For example, you may have a topic that you particularly like seen to be investigated, or you may have thoughts about how it conducts its work, and so on. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts.
We're going to collect several. Yes. Here ahead. Yep.
Thank you, Lord Willetts. Andy Sellers from Silicon Catalyst. So we run an incubator relating to semiconductors. My question is, do you have concerns about disinformation relating to science and technology? And what is the response that we should take to alleviate those? And my question is really influenced about the background of hybrid warfare.
Right. And then we're going to collect another intervention at the front there. Yep.
Thank you, Lord Willetts. Jim Clark. I work for an agency, April 6th, that work to communicate science to the public. So I want to kind of build on that question. You seem, Dame Angela, to be quite positive about the public's view of science. I don't know if you saw the Campaign for Science and Engineering's recent research on particularly young people seem to be losing faith a bit in R&D and what it can actually do, whether it's a priority we should be really focusing on now, whether it's a bit of a luxury. So it'd be good to hear what your thoughts are on overall the public's view of science and how we can improve that. Thank you.
Thank you. Angela, over to you.
Very good. Thank you. I love foresight. I think it's a really terrific bit of government, and I think it was an excellent thing to have set up. There are two things I want foresight to do. So I am hoping we will have a foresight project on childhood, on the future of childhood. I can't remember, there was so much, I mean, that was something we've been thinking about before the Opportunities mission arose. And it would be more probably childhood and young people, actually. So longer than the very good Academy for Medical Sciences report about the importance of the first 5 years. And the reason I think that is actually when I think back, so I grew up in London. And when I was a child in London, it was not uncommon for me to be playing in the garden and hear a bomb go off. Because, you know, bombs used to go off in London. And you think back and you think, God, well, how flippin' weird. I mean, how weird would it be if a bomb went off in London now? And, you know, we built a security system that means that doesn't happen. But I think the childhood of... I went to sort of very ordinary school. I mean, I was a totally ordinary middle-class child, both parents doctors. But I went to ordinary schools where there were some people who were actually really quite poor. And I think the equivalent children now in that bit of South London, I don't think their prospects are as good as my school friends were. I think things have gone backwards. And I think we need to think about why that is. And I think one of the things that has worked, I think, well in government is that the security bits of government are very well joined up. People have whole careers where they just move from one security department to another. And they will know each other, and they meet in person, and, you know, there's even a word for it. You can be a securocrat. And I don't think we really have a good enough thing like that for what should government be doing about children. And I think it's too important to leave alone. The other thing I think we need to do with foresight is, I would love more of it to be a bit public, actually. One of the things, it's not actually so much that bit. We have that same team produced tech assessments. So they're doing one about robots at the moment, hence our round table. I would really love for them to produce some beautiful materials. You know, we do all this work, and yes, we write sort of slightly dry documents for our colleagues. But actually, in the process of doing that, we gather this fantastic information. And I just would love one of the things I would love to exist when I leave is a series of maybe a dozen tech assessment posters that could sit in a school. And one of them would definitely be about robots, because I really like robots. But also, you know, one about engineering biology. Well, what's engineering biology? Yes. And they would be things... I'm sort of slightly in despair about science education. I have 3 children. The youngest is 24. They all did science. And all of them went through, you know, the Slough of Despond, which is GCSE science. Yeah. And, you know, actually, frankly, it's amazing that anybody sticks with science and does A-level. One of my most cherished parents' evening moments, and there are not many of them, was sat behind probably the cleverest girl in the year, not my daughter, also the naughtiest. And it was the stage at which, you know, they try and persuade the children to do their A-level, so they were trying to persuade this girl to do science A-levels. And she looked at them and she said, well, miss, is it going to be more cut and paste? But, you know, what are we doing? Making clever 16-year-olds cut things out with scissors and stick them down with glue as a way of teaching them anything, let alone something as exciting as science. I've now forgotten again.
Yes, misinformation.
Yes, I am worried about misinformation. Do you know what? I think we should talk more to... This is not a snide remark about advertising agencies, but I don't understand why we don't engage more with the world of advertising about changing people's opinion, because that's what we're trying to do, right? Or we're trying to stop other people from doing. And again, I would have thought the school curriculum does require a bit that is about, well, how do you check? And you have to check everything.
Yep. I'm going to go back to the online just to make sure that their voice is heard. And you've touched on briefly on industrial strategy,
Yes.
but a question on that has been upvoted. What are the prospects for an industrial strategy which is genuinely enduring and coordinated with strategies across engineering, space, defence, quantum?
So I'm glad to say I had a fantastic brief at CSA's Brown Bag Breakfast this morning from the people who are doing the industrial strategy. There are 8 things in the industrial strategy. I can't remember what they are anyway. So we had rather an interesting conversation about, well, first of all, how do so the industrial strategy sits inside the growth mission, but obviously it needs to talk to all 5 missions. So we ended up with this sort of interesting idea about how does an octopus talk to a starfish. But that shouldn't be that difficult. We need to think about that. I mean, that's a difficult question, but we are in the happy situation that we do know what we're trying to do because we had the 5 missions. So I think, again, it's much easier to address a difficult question if you know where you're trying to get to. And we do.
Right. Very good. Thank you for that. Now we're going to collect some more. By the way, you're showing incredible stamina, by the way. You are doing brilliantly with these crisp answers to all the questions that keep going.
Oh, that's the trick. I remember now. They told me to go on for ages.
No. You're doing very well. We've just got 10 more minutes. And of course, there will be an opportunity for our physical attendees, if you're staying on for dinner, to also ask some questions then. But there's a group of people in the middle. I think I see Jeremy Clayton there for a start. So let's get the microphone to him and the people around him. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Jeremy Clayton, previously Director, Go Science. Angela, when do you think you will be advising the Prime Minister that actually we ought to be putting as much effort into planning for a 3-degree world as into net zero?
Soon.
Right. I think there was a question there. We must hear that. I do apologise.
No, it's okay. Thank you. My name is Mandula. I'm doing my PhD at Loughborough. I think we already met. But you mentioned that there's a bit of a delay in academics getting the skills required to be a part of policy making. So as someone who is in that position but would like to be in your position 20 years down the line, what general advice would you give?
Right, and we'll collect a third question from around. Yes, the lady there. Yeah.
Hi, Samanti Mansa, so AWE, so also MOD. So you were talking earlier about COVID being a time where it seemed like science was on the opposing side of the economics. So obviously, someone else brought up net zero, climate change. In situations like that, how do you reconcile the people who are quote-unquote pro-science and the people who are quote-unquote pro-economics, and where do you find that middle ground?
Very good, terrific question. I don't know when we'll be advising to prepare for 3 degrees. I think we need to be advising to get on with preparing now. And I would say it's the only thing that I it's the biggest thing that I really worry that I don't see where it fits into the missions. Because the energy mission is very clearly and fantastically a net zero mission. And I hadn't actually understood that adaptation used to be seen as the thing you did after you gave up. And I don't think we give up. But I think we need to get on with adaptation now, as it was put very clearly and succinctly by the CSA for transport last month. Well, it's only September and the railways are already underwater. Yeah. What should we do? Next, so we are plotting amongst us CSAs, about how to get this brought up the agenda. And that includes having, sort of, I tell you what I really don't want is for somebody to say, yes, that's my thing, and then not do it. I think already the advice is starting to come through that 1.5 is gone. What to do? Stick with it. And when it all seems hopeless, stick with it. It's a long game. I think find things you really love doing. I think when you can, go off and try bits of government. But I suspect that to get my job in 20 years' time, which I very much hope you do, you will need to be a card-carrying scientist. So be a scientist or an engineer first. I think there's no reason why my job shouldn't be done by an engineer. But go and get your sort of union card as a scientist or an engineer, as well as maintaining your interest in policy. Fantastic. Good. And finally, yes. Well, didn't Nick Stern do us a great job there by saying it's not net zero or the economy, it's both, dummy. So I think that's done. Somebody in the audience can tell me better than I can tell you. Do we need to revisit that? I don't think so. That we need to carry on making the net zero investment now.
But I think partly the question may have been the fact it was interesting that summation report on climate change was written by an economist, and that there wasn't. And that was the most vivid single bit of communication we've had about the long-term costs of climate change. And there are so many different frameworks of analysis. Part of your job is to think about ways in which they can be integrated when they work in such different ways.
Yes, I agree. And I mean, I would say one of the many gaps in my knowledge that I most worry about is economics. I don't think it's a surprise that in the end it was the language of economics that put that case in a way that was easy for government to assimilate and act on. And I suppose thinking about COVID, that's my regret. Really what I regret is that we didn't have the conversation, I think the right conversation that said keeping this under control will save you money in the long run.
Yes, very interesting. And economics is a way of trying to value the future, and has got.
Yeah, and I think very specifically, I do think I should have a proper conversation with the OBR, because they sort of hold the pen on a lot of those calculations. Don't know. What do you think? I mean.
Yeah, I mean, someone from Resolution Foundation now runs the OBR, and there is an extraordinary amount of power. And of course, the most controversial feature of Nick Stern's report was what discount rate he was using and what weight you attach to future costs and benefits compared with today's costs and benefits. And the OBR, a surprising amount of big policy decisions look very different depending on what discount rate you apply to future. And that's a high priority for you, thinking about resilience and risk. And the OBR can only do things that they are tasked by ministers and within their legal framework, but perhaps some broadening of their remit to do more valuing of the future would be.
They're the people I've seen produce counterfactuals that don't get questioned.
Ah, right. Very interesting. Yeah. Okay, there's a lady there. We're going to collect. I think we'll have the last few questions. As I say, if the people who've got your hand up, if you are staying for dinner, please will you put your arm down, and I will, because you're going to have another chance. So we've got a manageable list. Now at the back, you're not staying for dinner, right? I don't want to reward people for not saying, but you understand. Hi. Hi, Ian.
I will be hungry, but I'm not staying for dinner.
Right.
I wonder if we could look at the European side of this and how much you get involved, because this government is slightly more positive about Europe than its predecessor. And Carol Mondell, of course, you know well from her previous roles. And I just think that the Horizon programme, there's a lot of judgment still to be made about it, but it's a key programme, and the European Commission is getting more and more interested in pushing science. So to what extent are you involved in some of those discussions?
We're going to ask that Europe question, and I'm going to add one other from the online participants, which is a great note on which to end as well. What are your priorities for the next 12 to 24 months? What would you like to achieve? So those are your final two questions.
Europe, yes, I should do more. I'm off to Europe towards the end of this year to spend time in Berlin and Paris. I think mostly with my counterparts there, I mean, in as much as they have those structures. I would very much hope to build more interaction with European colleagues where it's helpful. To a certain extent, remember, of course, we do have a chief scientific advisor in the Foreign Office. And one of the things I need to be quite careful not to do is tread on my CSA's toes. But I think there are more things I could do. I don't yet have a plan to go to the Commission. I would have to have permission to do that. So we'll see. And yeah, for the next 24 months, so let's have a think. 24 months will take me to within shooting distance of finishing, because I'm sort of 18, 20 months in. So I already told you about mid-career scientists into the civil service. So that's part of a bigger ambition about a more scientific civil service. And the other half of that is really about looking after the people we've got, either helping the scientists who are civil servants build really successful careers, or helping people who are not civil servants, who are not scientists, ask for help all the time. I would rather that some scientists said to them, I don't think there's really any science in here, than that they decide that there isn't any science in there. And we do actually have training material along those lines. So that's one of the, there are 4 things on this list. So that was more scientific civil service. Second thing is science for security and resilience, and that's mostly about being SAGE ready. So that is this, and the thing I would love to have more of there is, we have this thing called the National Risk Register, always had it. And I would love us to have more of sort of pre-prepared, thought through what would the policy questions be. We're working on that. Each time sort of something bubbles up to the surface, we work together to produce a set of those. What could go, I mean, of course, you can't tell what's going to go wrong, but a lot of the questions, you can sort of guess what the questions will be, because they're going to be, what can we do to mitigate this thing? And quite often, have we got enough resource to look after the people who've been hurt? And then, of course, another one, which is, who's vulnerable? Who's going to get hurt here? So that's my top priority in national security and resilience. My current priority, I sort of pick a topic every year. The first year, sort of AI was kind of everybody's topic. For this year, my top topic is engineering biology. And that mostly consists of me tromping around, reminding everybody that engineering biology is much more than drugs and vaccines. Because actually, rather a lot of people think that engineering biology is drugs and vaccines, which of course it's very exciting for, but it's also fuels and circular economy and new building materials and, just a whole ton of exciting things. I'm visiting a place where they're making a engineering biology handbag. I think it's next week. I'm pretty excited, actually. And then the final one is the bit of our organisation that runs foresight and technology assessments. And I already talked a bit about our ambitions. Frankly, I mean, to be sort of a bit crude about it, to sell that stuff even harder into government. I think, personally, we as an organisation are a bit sort of shy about knocking on the door and saying, excuse me, did you know there's this? So those are my, over the next 2 years, those are things I would love to have changed.
What an excellent list, and what a fantastic note on which to have ended. It's so good of you, Angela. You have taken so many questions in the past 90 minutes and all answered with rigour and courtesy, and thank you very much for that. Thank you too for our sponsors, ARC and Air2. Thank you to our online participants who sadly can't join us for a drink, but I've tried to ensure that your questions were properly included in the discussion. Everyone physically here is welcome to join us for a drink and dinner. Our next FST event, which actually picks up on a question we were asked, our next FST event is in Liverpool on the 23rd 3rd of October, asking to what extent should science and technology budgets be devolved to elected mayors and other local agencies. That's what we'll be focusing on there. But now I think we can adjourn for a drink, and Angela, above all, has earned one after a fantastic session. Thank you very much. Very good of you. Very good of you.
If anyone wasn't staying for dinner but wants to, we've had a few no-shows, so if you weren't planning to stay for dinner but you suddenly get a bit hungry, there'll be some food for you.